In the soft light of July 1994, a small charter family motored their catamaran Sea Glass across a lonely stretch of the South Pacific. It was supposed to be a 2-week dive holiday, 8 people chasing reefs that shimmered after dark. By dawn the next morning, their radio would be silent. The boat would lie splintered against an uncharted volcanic island, and 2 of them would never be seen alive again. That afternoon felt wonderfully ordinary. Mark Barrington, an ex-Navy navigator turned weekend skipper, swapped jokes with his wife Elena while their teens, Lena and Sam, filmed dolphins with a clunky Hi-8 camcorder. Amateur documentarian Maya balanced her VHS shoulder cam, promising her fledgling cable access audience a paradise special. Nearby, Luis, a quiet engineer on sabbatical, checked engine temps, and Priya, a graduate marine biologist, logged clownfish in a weather-stained notebook. Mark's brother Owen frowned at the barometer. Its needle was falling like a stone. By nightfall, a newborn tropical storm swelled right over their course. Too fresh for 1994 weather feeds, too fierce for the catamaran's twin diesels to outrun. Wind shredded the mainsail, lightning cracked the mast, and a wall of water smashed the galley windows. Mark seized the mic and shouted, "Mayday! 8 souls aboard, taking water fast!" The only answer was static, and the sharp pop of fuses behind him. As the hull split open, the ocean devoured their world piece by piece. Paper charts, VHS tapes, even Maya's camera as it whirred until the tape warped and died. The 8 survivors clung to driftwood in prayer, pitched toward a jagged silhouette of land ringed with reefs. Hours later, sunrise would reveal carnage. 2 bodies lost to the surf, 6 bloodied and alone on alien sand. What none of them knew was that Priya's soaked notebook carried a forgotten SOS frequency, one almost no vessel still monitored in 1994. Armed with scraps of copper, a broken camcorder motor, and the thinnest thread of hope, the 6 would fight to make the ocean answer back. Because out here, survival isn't just about strength. It's about sending a signal the sea can't ignore. And as you'll soon learn, someone or something did hear them. July 17th, 1994 dawned bright and forgiving, painting the South Pacific in ribbons of cobalt and jade as the catamaran Sea Glass pushed an easy 10 knots across the glassy swell. Mark Barrington stood at the rail with salt spray prickling his sun-browned arms, the tattoos of old Navy deployments half faded beneath a fresh layer of sunscreen. 5 years had passed since he'd traded gray warships for charter holidays, and mornings like this convinced him he'd chosen well. Beside him, Elena cocked her Nikon to catch a pod of spinner dolphins vaulting the bow wake. Each click of the shutter sounded like a promise that beauty, once framed, could be kept forever. Their daughter Lena, all 17 years of restless ambition, leaned daringly over the lifeline with a chunky Hi-8 camcorder, trying to film the dolphins in slow motion. Her kid brother Sam lay sprawled on the trampoline net, bare feet dragging the water, counting bubbles and sketching sea monsters in a spiral notebook he guarded like treasure. A little farther aft, a VHS shoulder camera rested on the slope of Maya Delgado's collarbone as she narrated for an audience she hoped would one day stretch beyond the reach of local cable. "Day 3 on the dazzling Barrington Sea," she intoned, before laughing at her own corny flourish. Luis Ramirez, the quiet engineer taking a sabbatical from designing engines no one would remember. Listened to the hum of the diesels the way musicians listen to a key change, hunting the faintest note of trouble. And at the helm, Mark's older brother Owen checked course, wind, and, more than once, the barometer that was drifting south with unsettling speed. Though the gauge needled at his instincts, Owen said nothing. Summer squalls flickered out here like stray thoughts, and everything else looked perfect. It was a day of small rituals. Mark cast a trolling line in hopes of wahoo. Elena sprinkled cumin over the mahi they'd hooked the night before and promised tacos by noon. Luis disappeared into the starboard engine bay and resurfaced with black diesel stripes across his knuckles and a grin that said the filter swap had gone smoothly. At the saloon table, Maya played their eclectic mixtape, Pearl Jam melting into Ace of Base, through a speaker that sounded as if it had weathered one too many beach bonfires. The teenagers complained good-naturedly about her ancient music. Maya countered that in 10 years they'd call it vintage and charge extra for the nostalgia. They took lunch on the aft deck under an awning rigged from a sailbag, finger-licking tacos chased by lime wedges Mark insisted cured seasickness. Lena teased Maya about using her TV voice even off camera. Maya teased back that teenage angst was yesterday's news. Sam, forever curious, asked Priya Kapoor, currently snorkel wet and clutching a battered field notebook, how many sharks could live on a single reef? Priya answered in such rapid mathematical detail that Sam's eyes glazed with delight and confusion in equal measure. Owen, sipping instant coffee laced with a hint of rum, finally mentioned the falling millibars. Probably a squall way out west, he concluded, waving off concern with the same steady hand that had steered boats through far worse. The moment felt stitched together by sunlight and easy laughter, exactly the kind of memory that replays in slow motion after tragedy rewrites context. Yet subtle omens crept in. By mid-afternoon, faint wisps of cirrus smeared the western horizon thin as exhaled smoke. Owen called a passing cargo ship for an updated weather fax and heard only a casual warning of minor convection. "Not unusual," said the crackling voice. "Enjoy your holiday." Still, he shaved a few revolutions off the diesels and nudged the cat south of the shipping lane so Elena would have fewer mast lights to spoil her Star Trail photos. She thanked him with a kiss on his sun-salted cheek, stowed her cameras for twilight, and slipped below to pull film canisters from the mini-fridge. Before sunset, with golden light feathering the deck in honey tones, Maya filmed what she intended as the day's final sign-off. The entire group gathered in silhouette, dolphins gone, sky ablaze. "If tomorrow is anything like today," she declared, "paradise may need a new name." Sam groaned at the line's cheesiness. Everyone else applauded. In the camcorder's viewfinder, the red tally lamp winked as if it too savored the scene. The evening routine rolled forward. Anchor dropped near an unmarked seamount, generator humming to cool Elena's film stock. Lena and Sam squabbling, gentle this time, over top bunk rights, Luis tightening hose clamps by flashlight. As stars ignited overhead, Priya lay on the trampoline with a grease pencil, tracing constellations on a plastic chart and jotting tidal estimates in the corners of her field notebook. Out of habit, she listed backup communication channels, among them the near-obsolete 500 kHz Morse distress band. By 1994, most modern ships relied on the new Global Maritime Distress and Safety System, but Sea Glass sailed on trustier VHF and Mark's practiced knack for reading weather. Radios still made Priya's private list of things worth trusting, though she'd penciled a small question mark beside them lately. Below deck, the diesel generator sputtered into steady rhythm, powering cabin fans and the galley fridge. Occasional creaks of the catamaran's composite beams punctuated the hush, like a house settling. Nobody saw the ragged cloud line scaling the horizon. No satellite relayed its warning in time, and the cargo ship far astern had drifted out of radio range before its weather fax updated. At 2:11, the first gust slapped the rigging with a wooden thwack, jerking Owen awake in the cockpit. He blinked at the anemometer. Wind had trebled in 20 minutes. Lightning ghosted inside distant clouds, brilliant but still silent. Below, water glasses clinked together as the cat flexed. Owen called down for Mark, and Mark, half-dressed, met him with the question already in his eyes. They reefed the remaining canvas, fired the diesels, and felt the cat surge forward as if trying to outrun its own shadow. The barometer needle plunged again, another 3 millibars in an hour. Rain arrived sideways, a stinging sheet blowing so hard it felt dry until it struck skin, then exploded in cold needles. Elena scrambled to lash camera crates. Priya clipped her notebook into a harness and slammed hatches shut. Maya jammed a new tape into the shoulder camera. She couldn't help herself, and whispered a prayer over the whir of the loading mechanism. Luis killed the fridge to spare amperage, heard the generator cough once, then settle. Mark punched the VHF distress key. Static crackled, taunting. He tried again. "Mayday! Mayday! Charter vessel Sea Glass. 8 persons, position 12 south, 141 west, taking heavy seas." The storm answered with a muscular roll of thunder that shook the mast stays. Somewhere below, a fuse popped, lights flickered, and the radio fell dark. In the fractional silence that followed, storm roar outside, but inside only held breaths. Sam's sketchbook slid off the saloon table and flapped open on the soaked floor. A drawing of a sea monster stared up, jaws wide. Owen caught Sam's gaze and tried to grin. The boy's face was pale in the green glow of the emergency panel. Lightning strobed again, closer now, and the horizon vanished behind a solid wall of black. Every person aboard felt the moment tip. Later they would each describe it differently. An invisible line crossed, a sudden hollow in the chest, a prickle along the scalp, but all would agree it was the instant Paradise became predator. Soon the mainsail would rip like paper, the batteries would drown in a sluice of seawater, and 8 voices would cry into a void that seemed to swallow sound itself. Yet for one more heartbeat of borrowed calm, sea glass still floated, and the small world built on her decks, jokes, tacos, mixtapes, notebooks, and dreams, clung together against the dark, unaware that by sunrise 2 seats at the breakfast circle would be empty forever, and the survivors would be fighting not just for rescue but for proof that someone somewhere could still hear them. Lightning bled across the clouds just after midnight, revealing a sky torn open from horizon to horizon. The wind that slapped sea glass an hour earlier now howled so hard it stole the breath from Mark Barrington's throat when he tried to shout orders. Spray came sideways in sheets so dense it looked like smoke, and every loose line on deck whipped itself into a snaking blur. Elena jammed extra D-cell batteries into her flashlight, but the beam collapsed under the rain in seconds. Down in the saloon, Sam and Lena wrestled camera cases into lockers that were already ankle-deep in seawater sloshing through the floorboards. Owen fought the helm with white-knuckled silence, watching the compass spin as the rudders lost bite. The mast, already cracked by a stray lightning bolt, shrieked once, twisted, and snapped at the spreaders. 800 pounds of aluminum crashed across the coach roof, tearing sailcloth to ribbons and crushing the starboard lifelines. A shard speared the deck beside Priya, missing her thigh by inches. She barely flinched, too busy slamming a screwdriver into the battery panel, trying to bypass fuses she hoped were merely wet, not fried. The radio remained dead, its faceplate dark as slate. In the engine bay, Luis smelled raw diesel and scorched insulation. A cooling hose had split, flash steaming the starboard cylinder. When he reached in, a belt lashed his wrist, drawing blood that washed away before he even felt the sting. He killed the engine to keep it from seizing, then pounded up the ladder, shouting, "Starboard's gone! Port's next if we over-rev!" The words blew sideways off his tongue, but Mark caught enough to know they were out of propulsion. The catamaran skidded down a mountainous swell and buried her bows. Green water roared across the foredeck, tore free both tramp nets, and swept every unsecured object, snorkels, seat cushions, Sam's sketchbook, into the dark. The cockpit bimini exploded like tissue. On its way through, the waves stole Maya's shoulder camera. She lunged, caught the carry strap, and felt the weight rip her down the companionway steps, slamming her spine against the teak rail. When she surfaced again, the rig was gone, and seawater foamed in the saloon like shaken beer. Mark made the call he'd sworn never to make. Abandon ship. The orange 6-man lifer aft lived in a hard canister aft, lashed with webbing. He knifed the lashings, hands shaking, blades slipping once and slicing his palm, while Elena clipped emergency flares to her vest and herded the teenagers outside. They inflated the raft with a roar that almost vanished under the wind, shoved it over the transom, and kept the painter line tied fast so the boat could serve as a lee during boarding. Owen stayed on the wheel till the last heartbeat, trying to quarter the waves, giving everyone a platform that didn't buck sideways. Lena crossed first, leaping the widening gap between stern and raft. Sam followed, flopping hard onto the orange floor and scrambling to haul in his sister. Elena tossed a dry bag full of film, then Priya passed her notebook. A waterlogged brick that suddenly felt precious as gold. Luis shouldered a toolbox across and nearly toppled when a gust caught the lid and flung it open like a sail. Mark yelled for Maya. She answered from the forward hatch, breathless, clutching two handheld VHFs she'd scavenged. She passed them to Elena, then swung aft along the shattered lifelines, knees buckling each time the deck dropped away from her boots. Another swell rose behind them, darker than the night itself, ridged with white claws. Owen saw it first and shouted her name, but the wind shredded the syllables. The wave hit broadside. Sea glass rolled past 30 degrees past 40, groaning like a dying animal. Maya lost her grip. So did Owen. The water took them both in a single breathless flash, sweeping them across the wrecked tramp frame and overboard into a writhing blackness that closed as quickly as it opened. Mark dove to the rail, flung his arms into nothing but spray, and screamed their names. Lightning stuttered, showed two life vest strobes bobbing far astern, then killed the light before anyone could track direction. The raft painter snapped with a rifle crack. The inflatable spun free. Inside, 6 bodies tumbled over one another. Priya fumbled the raft knife and severed the trailing shreds of line before they could tangle in the ballast bags, then punched the sea anchor release. The fabric chute snagged the current and slowed their drift, but steering was impossible. Behind them, Sea Glass fought one more broadside, then capsized with a hollow boom of imploding hatches. Air hissed from flooded cavities as the cat turned turtle and disappeared in a froth of white. The storm swallowed the sound as if erasing a sentence mid-word. For hours, the raft climbed walls of water and slid down roaring valleys. Rain hammered so hard the floor became a cold bath. The bailer never rested. Mark called repeatedly on the backup VHFs. Channel 16 first, then 6, then any frequency he could twist the knob to. But only static answered, punctuated by the hiss of wind battering the rubber canopy. Each time lightning lit the world, he counted seconds for distance, watching the gap shrink. 10 miles, then 5, then one rumble so immediate the air tasted like copper. He prayed the strike would miss their tiny orange target. The next instant, a bolt speared the sea half a mile off the port bow, searing every retina white. Near dawn, the wind eased from a scream to a broken moan. Clouds thinned, revealing a bruised violet sky, and first light sketched the horizon. Through the porthole flap, Lena spotted a jagged silhouette, an island, black and saw-toothed, more threat than refuge, but undeniably land. No charts on Sea Glass had shown anything within 50 nautical miles. Mark pressed binoculars to his swollen eyes and found no sign of Maya or Owen, only endless slicks of foam knifed by current. The storm's back was broken, yet its damage lingered in every rasping breath and raw skin knuckle. Luisha's wrist had swollen to twice its size. Priya's notebook pages were glued into a sodden lump. Sam shivered uncontrollably despite the humid dawn, eyes locked on the spot where Sea Glass had vanished. Elena hugged him close, her own camera dry bag clutched against her chest like a life talisman. They took stock. 1 raft, 3 flares, 2 half-drowned VHFs with corroded battery doors, a single bottle of fresh water, a damp bag of energy bars, and whatever stubborn will remained after a night carved out of nightmare. 6 voices now where 8 had laughed the afternoon before. Mark pointed the paddle blades toward the island. The distance looked manageable, but the current drifted south and the reef haze around the shore warned of breakers that could flip the raft as easily as swatting a fly. Still, it was land, and land meant hope of shelter. Maybe fresh water, maybe salvage from older wrecks. He set the first stroke. The others followed. The raft crept forward, every yard earned against the lazy tug of just dying wind. Behind them, the ocean closed its surface as though Sea Glass had never existed, as though 2 lives had not slipped under without ceremony. The storm had passed, but the ordeal had only begun, and somewhere inside each survivor a single question pulsed in time with their racing hearts. Had anyone heard them? Would anyone ever come? The island waited with no answers, only jagged rocks and a line of dark jungle above the tide, and as the sun rose they paddled toward it, 6 silhouettes against the glare, too exhausted to grieve, too stubborn to surrender, carried onward by the raw momentum of survival. The storm lasted only an hour. Yet in that hour the ocean rearranged everything. When the clouds lifted, driftwood and wreckage lined the beach. some new, some freshly exposed. Among the splinters lay sheets of twisted aluminum glazed by salt. At first glance it looked like ordinary debris until Luis, half delirious, murmured that he saw call letters stenciled beneath the corrosion. Mark and Priya dragged the largest section free. Under layers of barnacle crust, faded black numbers curved around a familiar shape. The skeleton of a tall radio mast, snapped near the base yet still half buried in the sand. Nearby, more parts of a structure, warped equipment racks, rusted patch panels, lengths of copper ground strap. Hinted this shore had taken another vessel long before sea glass. A shiver ran through Priya. Her notebook's unreadable pages hid that obsolete 500 kilohertz frequency, and here lay the ghost of a transmitter built for precisely that band. Wind rattled the loose metal like a dying bell. Mark stared at the wreckage, mind turning gears he hadn't used since naval signal school. If enough copper remained, if the mast section could be hoisted just 10 meters, if the raft's aluminum paddles could serve as capacitors. The thoughts came fast, fragile as spider silk yet undeniably alive. Behind him, Elena yelled. Sam had collapsed beside Luis, eyes rolled white, his thin body shaking uncontrollably. Heat, hunger, shock, anyone could have triggered it. Panic spidered through Mark's tenuous calculation, but Priya gripped his elbow hard. "If we don't raise help soon," she said, voice lower than the surf, "we'll lose more than 2. Thunder rumbled again in the distance, not a fresh storm, but the growl of far-off weather reminding them how small they remained. Mark swallowed, picked up a length of corroded copper, and felt the weight of both burden and chance. Night would come quickly. They had maybe 18 hours of daylight left before Luis's fever might tip into the point of no return, before Sam's convulsions could cycle back, before dehydration and despair robbed them of the strength to try. Everything had indeed grown worse, far worse than the storm itself. But in the shattered bones of someone else's tragedy, they suddenly held the rusty seed of possibility. Mark raised the copper toward the gray sky. In that gesture, every survivor caught the flicker of something they'd almost forgotten. A reason to fight the island rather than merely outlast it. Whatever dawn held, they would greet it working, not waiting. Because the ocean had stolen enough already. And if a voice could be conjured from rust and driftwood, they would wrench it into life. Even if it had to shout across time itself. The raft nosed through a final belt of surf and scraped onto black volcanic sand just after sunrise. Every limb shook with exhaustion, yet terror of being dragged back out by the undertow kept the 6 survivors moving. Mark and Luis hauled the inflatable clear of the wash, then collapsed beside it, lungs fluttering like torn sails. For several long minutes, nobody spoke. The island made its own introductions. Wind worrying the palm fronds higher up the slope. Unseen birds screaming inside the canopy. The steady percussion of breakers punching the reef they'd somehow threaded without flipping. When the tremors in his hands eased, Mark scanned their new domain. A ragged crescent beach curved between basalt cliffs whose surfaces looked melted and refrozen. Tide lines were littered with sun-whitened driftwood, ropes of seaweed, and shards of weather-beaten flotsam. A cracked flip-flop, the corroded nose of a fishing float, chunks of styrofoam eroded into pebble-sized beads. No footprints, no fishing shacks, no lazy curl of cooking smoke, only raw wilderness staring back. Elena popped the raft's waterproof bag and produced the last half-liter bottle of drinking water. 6 measured sips went around. Salt-split lips stung as the tiny ration disappeared. Sam looked at the bottle's hollow belly like a condemned man watching the gallows rope being tightened. They dragged the raft above the high tide line to serve as both shelter and brightest rescue marker they could spare. Luis slumped against it, his injured wrist ballooning purple beneath the improvised bandage. Pain made his breath hiss between clenched teeth, but worse was the low fever glazing his eyes. Salt water and diesel residue still coated the torn skin. Hunger announced itself next, blunt as a hammer. 23 hours had passed since tacos on the aft deck. The sealed pouch of energy bars, 8 rectangles fused into one soggy brick, offered perhaps 100 calories each. Elena cut it with Maya's raft knife, doling out slivers the width of matchsticks while reminding everyone that 3 days without food was survivable. 3 days without water was a line none of them could afford to toe. Mid-morning heat dropped like a curtain. Black sand soaked up the sun, turning the beach into a skillet that forced them toward the jungle edge where shade warped the air in cool green ripples. But stepping off the open beach felt like trading one danger for another. The tree line crouched thick in tangled vines woven tighter than a fishing net, floor slick with rot. Sam prodded the mat of leaves and winced when something quick and scaled shot deeper into the undergrowth. Mark organized an infuriatingly slow recon, 30 paces inland, then back, always in pairs. Priya went first with Lena, eyes peeled for anything that hinted at drinkable water. They returned empty-handed but reported a shallow ravine running parallel to the shore. No stream, only damp sand. Luis tried next with Sam and nearly fainted halfway, vertigo sending him to his knees until the world steadied. Fever had begun its stealthy march. By early afternoon, dehydration had turned tongues thick and heads muzzy. Elena caught Sam swallowing his own spit repeatedly and forced him to lie in the raft's shade. Temperatures climbed. Invisible insects discovered sweat-salty skin and left welts in tight, burning rows. Every problem felt amplified by the knowledge that no one in the wider world even knew where to start looking. As the sun slid past its zenith, Mark and Priya attempted a dangerous gamble. Paddling the raft back beyond the breakers to collect rainwater from towering thunderheads forming offshore. They launched with only one paddle and a coil of rope, planning to anchor on the far side of the reef and bail fresh rain straight off the canopy. Midway through the surf zone, a sneaker wave upended the raft sideways, ejecting both into swirling whitewater. Mark's life vest shot him upward. Priya surfaced an arm's length away, coughing. Worse than the dunking was the sight of the raft spinning belly up, ballast pockets trapped with air so it refused to self-right. Twice Mark kicked toward it, twice the surf hurled him onto coral that shredded skin like cheese wire. By the time he and Priya wrestled the raft back ashore, empty-handed, bleeding, morale punctured, daylight had already begun its long gold slide toward dusk. Elena's eyes tracked the horizon for any speck of ship or slice of contrail. Nothing. She tied a bandana around Mark's bleeding calf, lips tight. That brief, almost invisible shake of her head declared the obvious. Their margin for mistakes had vanished. Night arrived fast near the equator, sucking color from the sky and replacing heat with a clammy breeze. They propped the raft into a lean-to against a driftwood frame, teeth clacking whenever wind forced its way through gaps. No flares wasted, no signal fires yet, wood too wet, energy too low. Instead, darkness settled among them, thick as the storm squall that wrecked their lives. Sleep came in ragged pieces, shredded by fever-muttered Spanish from Luis, the crash of distant surf and the phantom groans of sea glass still echoing in half-dreams. At some hour before dawn, Lena jolted awake, certain she had heard Maya calling her name beyond the surf. She sprinted toward the waterline before Elena's shouted warning jerked her back. The realization that hallucinations were settling in felt like another invisible wound. Morning brought a pale sun and a new crisis. Luis's wrist now smelled faintly sweet, the skin hot and shiny. Infection. They had no antibiotics, no true splint, nothing but strips of raft canvas and resolve. Mark debated opening the 2 remaining flares, one white, one red, to sterilize fabric in their heat, but losing a signal device could trade 1 life for 6. He tabled the idea with a promise to revisit if Luis's pulse climbed higher. Priya insisted on exploring farther, convinced water had to lie inland where the ravine deepened. She and Mark cut a crude machete from broken aluminum and hacked through tangled green until sweat stung their eyes. Half an hour in, the ravine walls pinched, and a faint, cool draft rose from below. Priya dropped to her knees, scooping damp sand. She tasted it, brackish but filtered enough to drink if settled. Mark scraped a shallow basin. Water seeped in slowly, clear after 2 pours. They called this victory and hurried back with half a billy can sloshing. perhaps a single liter, but psychologically as restoring as a banquet. Yet hope flagged again upon return. Sam, restless and weak, had wandered barefoot along the tide pools and found the carcass of a reef shark tangled in discarded netting. Excitement at potential food crashed when Priya pointed out the flaccid belly and sun-clouded eyes, rotten, unfit to touch. The sight made hunger sharper, its edges serrated. Through the afternoon, clouds piled high, blackening the sun. The survivors welcomed the cooling shadow right until thunder rolled. Deeper, slower than the last storm, but a storm nonetheless. Wind raced the beach and sent sand stinging like buckshot. With no structure except the fragile raft lean-to, they huddled beneath it while a squall pounded the island. Rain turned the sand to soup, seeped under canvas, soaked clothes, but the canteens Mark had fashioned from trimmed driftwood joints began to fill with sweet runoff. Even fear couldn't mute the desperate gratitude in every gulp they stole from the makeshift spouts. Priya waited until the flare sputtered out, then pointed at the masthead guy line. If someone acknowledges, we'll hear it as a carrier wave bounce in the gap, like faint thunder. Doesn't matter what language. Mark nodded, though the odds felt cruel. 500 kilohertz monitoring stations had been shutting down for years. But hope once sparked is difficult to kill. They set watches through the night, Elena and Mark till midnight, Priya and Lena till dawn. Sam curling against Luis to share warmth. Wind rose just after 2 in the morning, rattling palm fronds like a warning rattle, yet the guy lines held. Elena dozed, chin on chest, until a hiss, not surf, not wind, teased her ear. She jerked upright, the sound vanished. Mark's eyes shot open. Together they bent over the transmitter gap, listening. Silence. A mocking wave slapped the beach. Then, so faint it seemed a trick of blood pulsing behind eardrums, 3 evenly spaced crackles sparked blue between the contacts. Pop, 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 pop. Not thunder, not random discharge. 9 pulses and answering SOS. Elena's breath hitched. Mark woke Priya with a hand on her shoulder. Her first focus fell on the silent spark gap propped between stones. A sob, half joy, escaped before she smothered it. They argued in whispers about replying. Conserve power or confirm receipt? Priya pressed the bedspring key lightly, sending RCVD followed by STANDBY. The motor groaned as Mark cranked anew. They waited. Minutes crawled, no return spark. Maybe the signal had skipped, maybe atmospherics ate the path. Yet the ashes of despair felt cooler now. A coal revived. Dawn painted the horizon blood orange and peach, finding the 6 huddled like conspirators around their contraption. Luis stirred, fever still high, but eyes clearer, searching faces. Mark managed a ragged grin. "We heard something," he said. "We're not alone." Luis closed his eyes, a tremor of relief passing through him. The sun climbed. Clouds broke in towering stacks, promising oppressive heat or another drench. No way to guess. But the mast's shadow etched a straight line across the sand, pointing seaward like an unfinished sentence waiting for its next word. Whether or not the ocean would finish speaking today, the survivors now had evidence of an ear somewhere on the other end of the dark. For the first time since sea glass cracked in 2, the day began not with dread, but with a task they could believe in. Keep the copper standing. Keep the dynamo turning. Keep the signal alive until help, human or otherwise, followed the faint thread of dots and dashes back to this forgotten shore. Morning light seeped through low cloud, bleaching the beach a dull pewter as Mark crouched over the rust-gnarled sections of mast they had hauled from the tide line. The metal was pitted, corroded, but when he scraped a thumbnail across the inside face, it revealed a ribbon of clean copper still clinging beneath decades of salt. Copper meant conductivity. Conductivity meant a voice. He felt the old navigator's itch, solve, build, signal, flare alive for the first time since sea glass went under. While Priya steadied Luis in what shade the crippled raft could offer, Mark enlisted Lena and Elena to clear a workspace above the high tide mark. They dragged driftwood logs into a crescent, rolled flat stones for a tabletop, and propped the longest mast fragment on two forked branches like a seesaw. Sam, still pallid from the previous night's seizure, insisted on helping. Elena hesitated, then allowed him perimeter duty, stacking debris that might conceal useful parts. Within an hour, the boy had scavenged a handful of promising treasures: a sprung bedspring, lengths of nylon line, the plastic husk of a portable cassette player, and a fist-sized DC motor scavenged from the ruined Hi-8 camcorder. When he placed the motor beside the copper tubing, Mark's eyes flicked up in sudden admiration. A tiny dynamo in waiting. Priya knelt beside the mast section, fingertips tracing bolt holes that once anchored insulators. If we get this 10 meters up, the wavelength on 500 kilohertz will load just enough to radiate. Mark cocked an eyebrow, impressed, not surprised. She met the look with a half shrug that read graduate school side hobby. The frequency was her forgotten specialty. Now it was their lifeline. Raising any piece of mast required leverage the six of them barely owned. They chose two palms near the ravine mouth, lashed driftwood poles into an A-frame, and threaded Luis's splinted crutch through the mast's eyelets to act as a pivot pin. Luis himself, left arm cradled and feverish, directed from the sand, calling out stabilizer angles he understood better than anyone. Every heave drove salt sweat into the torn skin on Mark's calf. Each grunt from Elena betrayed the toll of sleepless nights. Yet inch by inch, the copper throat of an antenna lifted toward gray sky until the mast stood keystone straight, guide with nylon line knotted around coral-anchored driftwood deadmen. The DC motor needed rotation. They unwound cassette player belts into a 5-meter loop, tied two paddles tip-to-tip into a crank, and seated the motor's shaft into a notched shell so it could spin freely. Sam, lighter than the adults, became designated cranker, perching on a driftwood stool and pedaling arms in circles until sweat dripped from his nose. The motor's leads, stripped and tinned in candle flame from a flare fuse, fed into the corroded chassis of an ancient transmitter chassis Priya unearthed under the sand. Tubes shattered, power section dead, but the keying circuit intact enough to thump a raspy spark across a gap when 6 volts appeared. Mark improvised a rudimentary Morse key from the bed spring and 2 film canisters hammered flat. Priya scratched the SOS sequence onto a shard of driftwood so no one's nerves fumbled the rhythm. Just after midday, with clouds still hiding the brutal sun, they tested the line. Sam cranked. The gap hissed. The copper sang a note too low for ears, but they prayed not too low for physics. The mast swayed, guy lines groaned, and a faint ozone tang ribboned through the air, the smell of electricity born the hard way. The first call went out in 3 cycles, each one lasting 15 seconds. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, silence, 30-second pause, repeat. The beach seemed to hold its breath, surf receding to a distant hush inside everyone's ears. Luis watched the horizon as if a cutter might burst from the very first syllable. Nothing did. They sent 5 more cycles, then stopped to spare Sam's muscles. Clouds parted, cataracts of sunlight struck the sand, and the mast gleamed like a new coin. Hope tasted metallic, mixed with salt and doubt. They rested, drank the morning's seep of brackish water, divided another brittle sliver of energy bar. Luis drifted in and out of fever dreams, whispering mechanical equations. Elena dabbed vinegar-salty rainwater on his swollen wrist, praying inflammation would ease. By late afternoon, they tried again. This time, Lena cranked while Sam kept time, chanting beats under his breath so the cadence stayed true. Priya keyed a longer message. 6 alive, 2 lost. Medical urgent. Position approximate 12 south 141 west. Request immediate assistance. Each character burned more charge. The motor's whine sagged as Lena's arms tired. Mark took over, veins on his forearms, standing like twisted rigging. He felt the generator heat through the paddlewood, smelled the insulation start to scorch, but forced one last perfect SOS before slamming the bed spring key open. Evening slid in with violet bruises across the sky. Low thunder muttered offshore, the trailing end of the earlier squall. They tugged the raft back into lean-to angle, wrapped Luis in every spare cloth, and lit the white flare inside a ring of stones to boil seawater in a flattened canteen cap. The flare's incandescent roar cast long shadows of the mast, transforming the beach into the deck of some ghost ship anchored between worlds. If a listening post out there had heard, the next 12 hours would matter more than any that came before. For the survivors, the fight had shifted from staying alive to understanding why they had been spared, why two had not, and what silent conduit had carried their broken Morse across 1,000 miles of hostile air. Those questions would wait for hospital cots and investigation rooms. For now, there was only the rhythmic chop of blades and the realization that the ocean, willing to kill without hesitation, had also delivered an answer when they built a voice determined enough to demand it. Sun burned high and harsh by mid-morning, and the copper mast baked so hot that the guy lines began to creak where nylon bit into wood. Mark wrapped driftwood wedges around every knot, afraid the strands might fuse and snap, while Priya sat cross-legged beside the transmitter, tapping short, polite bursts. Standby every 30 minutes, then listening with her ear almost against the spark gap. Each time the contacts cooled, they found fresh corrosion that had to be scraped with the raft knife. Salt air was trying to swallow their only voice before it could finish one conversation. Elena, eyes sunken from 2 nights of lost sleep, organized a food patrol. She, Lena, and Sam followed the ravine upstream until the sandy floor pinched into a narrow cleft of lava rock. There, pools of brackish water lingered in volcanic pockets. Small land crabs scuttled under overhangs, palm hearts and something that tasted like tart guava clung to the bank. It was meager, but after slurping muddy water for a day, the sweet, sour flesh felt almost luxurious. Elena filled 2 film canisters with filtered pool water and carried them like holy relics back to camp. Luis's fever hovered just below delirium, yet the promise of rescue kept his eyes clear. With his good hand, he coaxed flame from shredded canvas and dried palm frond, building a waist-tall cook fire in a pit Mark had scooped where the beach met jungle. The smoke pillar drew a straight gray exclamation mark against the sky. Good for signaling, but better for morale. Sam dropped crab shells onto a flat stone warmed by the fire, and the meat cooked in its own salty brine. The boy ate greedily, cheeks streaked with soot, and the color began to seep back into his face. Near noon, while Lena cranked the dynamo, the spark gap flicked 3 sharp pops, then a long crackle that made her yelp. Priya lunged forward, counting a 3-digit number repeated twice, 900. Followed by a pause and then the letters US hammered out in slower clicks. She scribbled on the driftwood tablet, heart jackhammering. 900 nautical miles, the most likely meaning, and the United States Coast Guard on the other end. Help wasn't close, but it was moving. When Priya keyed back RCVDETA, the gap hissed, then nothing. Static storms can swallow half a message, she reminded herself. Conditions would change at dusk. The news rallied everyone. Even Luis insisted on contributing, guiding Mark and Sam in binding his splinted crutch to a palm trunk and shaping it into a taller tripod for the mast guys. Mark cauterized Luis's wrist wound with the glowing head of the second white flare. Excruciating seconds that left the air sizzling with burnt cloth and skin but reduced the infection's spread. The smell made Lena gag. Luis only grunted once, tears streaming, then sagged back with a clenched smile. Late afternoon dragged a wall of gray cloud over the western horizon. Unwelcome déjà vu. The wind sharpened, breakers boomed farther out, and reef spray misted the beach. A second storm wouldn't wait for rescue. They needed something the Coast Guard could not ignore even in foul weather. Priya's mind raced through chemistry tables. Elena remembered the lithium camera batteries still sealed in her dry bag. Mixed with strips of wet magnesium from Maya's ruined flash housings and tightly wrapped in palm fiber, they could create a flare column hot enough to burn in rain. They worked feverishly. Mark unscrewed battery casings with the raft knife while Elena shaved magnesium slivers. Priya mashed palm fiber into resin using a flat lava rock. As twilight bled purple across the surf, they packed the mixture into a bamboo sleeve Sam hacked from a shoreline stalk. Luis traced ignition steps with trembling finger, heat fuse first, then rolled the sleeve under driftwood to shield faces, and declared it would burn white hot for at least 4 minutes, maybe more if the resin stayed dense. The wind carried an electric edge, whipping the mast until it moaned. Mark signaled a final transmission window before night. Coast Guard 900 nautical miles. Storm approach. Will fire flare dusk. The reply came back in a string so ragged with atmospherics they almost missed it. Cutter halibut 8 hours E-day. Hold signal. 8 hours, nearly dawn. But the weather could steal another boat just as easily as the first. They had no choice but to trust it. Rain arrived with the suddenness of a tossed bucket. Sheets hammered the beach and instantly quenched the cook fire, leaving the flare bundle their only dry tinder. Mark positioned it in the crook of 2 driftwood logs angled like an altar, then struck a flare fuse across the tip. A fountain of silver-white flame gushed skyward, bright enough to paint the underside of the storm clouds in strobing moonlight. Salt steam exploded where hot sparks hit wet sand. For 4 terrifying and magnificent minutes, the flare roared louder than the surf, a beacon screaming into the dark. When the magnesium finally collapsed in a shower of pink embers, they were alone again with wind and water. But overhead, clouds thinned, bleeding their cargo in steady rain instead of violent sheets, an omen that the worst might pass without a full cyclone spin-up. Priya scraped the mast base to keep the copper bright. Sam cranked. Elena pressed her ear to the spark gap until her neck cramped. At 2:27, a faint carrier tone bloomed between the contacts, steady, unwavering, then syllables. SIG RCVD, ETA 3 hours. Fly over first light. Lena burst into tears, laughter tangled inside. 3 hours crawled. They patched the raft lean-to twice where gusts ripped the canvas. Luis drifted but held on. Mark counted every lightning flash and tracked its silence afterward. Each gap widened, proof the storm's heart was drifting north. At 5:12, the eastern sky blushed gray. Wind eased to a ragged breeze. Priya tapped one last message. Cord fire till visual, and doused the gap so it wouldn't chew more electrode. Elena spotted the aircraft first, a speck too fast for a seabird, slicing a contrail under the morning star. Seconds later, the thwomp-thwomp of rotors punched through rising surf, and an HH-60 Jayhawk, Coast Guard livery blazing orange against dawn, banked low over the reef. The survivors erupted in shouts, waving a section of raft fabric so fiercely it tore down the middle. The helicopter yawed, hovered, then flared inland to avoid spray, downdraft flattening palms in its wake. Rescue swimmers dropped on cables, feet splashing into knee-deep surf. Their radioed voices sounded surreal against the months-old dream of silence. Mark tried to brief them. 2 deceased, 1 serious injury, 4 walking wounded. But words tangled behind relief. Luis was packaged first, lifted skyward in a Stokes basket as Sam gripped the edge until a rescuer pried his knuckles free. Next went Priestess and camera gear. Wait, Maya's card? Actually, they salvaged memory later. On shoreline, they recovered Maya's waterproof camera, maybe. Let's finish. Swimmers escort survivors, helicopter lifts, they watch island recede. We'll stop there because next part, aftermath, will describe rescue, etc. They strapped Luis into a Stokes basket. Sam held his good hand until the hoist began to rise. Priya followed, then Elena, then Lena, each swallowed by rotor wash and roped into safety. When the sling came for Mark, he paused beside the jury-rigged transmitter, palm resting on the warm copper. One rescuer gestured impatiently, but Mark took the fraction of a heartbeat to yank the bedspring key free and tuck it in his pocket, proof of the voice that had saved them. Then he clipped in, and the Jayhawk winched him skyward, sea and island spinning away beneath boot soles slick with rainwater and rust. As the cabin door thumped shut, Elena counted blankets. 6 this time, 1 for every soul still breathing. Out the window, the island shrank to a dark comma in endless blue, mast glinting weakly in dawnlight before vanishing beneath a roller of cloud. Mark closed his eyes, letting the engine vibration replace the storm's roar. Luis, sedated but alive, breathed in small, rattling puffs. The medtech nodded reassurance over the thrum. After the medical checks, the survivors assembled in the wardroom, shivering more from nerves than cold. An ensign laid out a chart and asked them to mark Seaglass's last known course. Mark's finger hovered above the paper before he drew a shaky line through blank blue patched only by scattered soundings. "There," he said. The storm was young. No one saw it spin up. The officer nodded but could not hide the surprise. Their raft had drifted nearly 40 nautical miles south overnight, threading a maze of reefs no cutter could have approached in the swell. News moved fast at sea. By afternoon, the halibut's satellite link crackled with calls. State Department, Maritime Insurance, 2 West Coast newsrooms that had intercepted an open Coast Guard bulletin. Elena asked for privacy, and the captain honored it, quieting the bridge chatter until they reached port. Still, the story leaked in fragments. 8 missing, 6 found alive. A homemade radio that shouldn't have worked since the Carter administration. Reporters spun phrases like miracle frequency and ghost transmitter, but the survivors had no space for headlines. They spent that first calm evening in a tight ring on the fantail, listening to the ship's wake and letting the hum of generators replace the phantom roar of wind. At dusk, the cutter doubled back past the island so a small RHI rescue craft could search the leeward shore. Floodlights combed the water until midnight, returning with debris, no bodies. Among the haul was a watertight pelican case Maya had lashed to a buoy line, inside dry tapes of everything she had filmed up to the moment the mast snapped. Priya pressed the case to her chest as if it were Maya herself. "She'd want the world to see it," she whispered. No one disagreed. On day 3, they berthed in Pago Pago. Cameras waited on the pier, flashes popping like distant lightning. But Coast Guard sailors formed a living wall and funneled the group straight into ambulances bound for LBJ Tropical Medical Center. Luis went to surgery. Infection had flirted with bone, but not one. Sam's convulsions were diagnosed as acute electrolyte collapse. Serious, reversible. Blood work on all showed dehydration, borderline kidney strain, deep fatigue. Doctors spoke of weeks of rest. Mark found the prescription laughably short. Grief found its voice in the white hospital quiet. Elena woke one night reaching for her brother-in-law's weathered ball cap, only to remember it lay somewhere beneath 60 feet of water. Lena compulsively replayed the last seconds she'd seen Maya alive, searching for an alternate move that might have saved her. Priya sat at the bedside, drafting a letter to Owen's ex-wife, explaining how his last act had been to hold Seaglass steady long enough to get the raft away. She rewrote that sentence 4 times, chasing a balance between heroism and honesty. 10 days after landfall, a plainclothes Coast Guard investigator debriefed them in a sunlit conference room. He confirmed no shore station officially monitored 500 kilohertz anymore. Only volunteer hobbyists and a handful of automated beacons kept ears on the band. Yet the record showed an uncorrelated burst of Morse at 0704 UTC on July 20. Logged by an aging receiver aboard Noe weather buoy NDB-4. Equipment not designed to decode, simply sensitive enough to note the spike. A satlink aboard Halibut had been scanning raw buoy data for unrelated reasons. The blip triggered an alert in a diagnostics routine, and the bridge petty officer on watch had forwarded it to headquarters out of what he later called sheer boredom. From there, the improbable path of rescue had unfolded. A chain of coincidences so narrow the investigator simply ended with, "Sometimes luck is kinder than we deserve." The Jayhawk cleared the reef and turned east, engines drumming a steady confidence none of the 6 had felt since Seaglass first groaned in the storm. Inside the cabin, a medic looped an oxygen line over Luis's face and slipped a thermistor under his tongue. The fever was dropping already, helped by a syringe of broad-spectrum antibiotics and the cold rush of altitude. Elena sat beside him, fingers still trembling against his good hand, watching the pulse oximeter climb as though each green digit might blink away the sight of Owen and Maya disappearing beneath black water. Across the aisle, Lena cradled Sam's head against her shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, searching past her for the jungle that was no longer there. When he realized the roar around them came from turbines, not wind, He mouthed a silent thank you toward the ceiling. Priya, knees up under her chin, held the driftwood tablet with their final Morse log. Grease pencil markings had smeared, but the three letters at the bottom, ETA, remained sharp enough to prove they hadn't imagined the answer that chased them out of the dark. 30 minutes later, the helicopter settled onto the deck of USCG cutter Halibut. The air was thick with diesel and salt, but it smelled of civilization. Deckhands guided stretchers under Luis and Sam. The rest followed, each draped in a blanket that felt absurdly soft after nights of sand and salt crust. Mark stepped last, still clutching the twisted bedspring key. A petty officer tried to steer him toward sickbay, but he paused at the rail instead, eyes fixed on the shrinking shape of the island. Only when the medic promised a second flyover to search for Maya and Owen did he let himself be led below. Triage was brisk, vitals, IV fluids, tetanus boosters. Priya's salt-rasped throat made the corpsman wince, but her lungs were clear. Elena's camera case, somehow dry inside the raft lean-to, yielded gauze-pure rolls of film. A junior officer tagged it as personal property, unaware that the images would later sell to a magazine. The fee donated to a small fund in Maya Delgado's name. Seed money for coastal biology scholarships the vlogger had once planned to endow when the show took off. The story of sea glass never quite ended on the hospital ward. Months slipped by, tests cleared, and the 6 survivors scattered back to jobs and classes and family dinners where everyone leaned in a little closer than before. Yet each July they converged. First in Honolulu for Coast Guard hearings, later in San Diego for Luis's surgery follow-ups. Eventually in Auckland because Mark couldn't bear the Pacific without dipping a toe into home waters. They called the gathering the 6th Blanket Reunion, an inside joke that tasted equal parts salt and tears. The first anniversary dawned clear and windless. At sunrise, the group boarded a rented sloop, motored 3 miles beyond the harbor mouth, and lowered 2 white wreaths into gently rolling swell, one for Owen, one for Maya. Elena snapped a single frame, then capped the lens. The film was for history, not headlines. Priya read a short passage from Maya's travel diary. The ocean is a mirror that shows us who we are when the land stops defining us. And let the page drift after the flowers. Sam dropped a thumb-sized brass bedspring, the original Morse key, into the water, watching it twirl until the sun caught and swallowed it. Mark said nothing. He only touched a hand to his chest where the outline of a fresh tattoo, a streak of lightning curling into the silhouette of a raft, still itched beneath gauze. In the months that followed, official answers proved elusive. The NOAA technicians confirmed buoy NDB-4 had recorded a 9-second carrier burst precisely when the survivors believed they heard the Coast Guard reply. But audio logs from Halibut's radio room were blank in that window. No outgoing transmission on 500 kilohertz, no relay from any volunteer shore station. The petty officer who forwarded the buoy anomaly swore he never sent an acknowledgement. The diagnostics bot, he insisted, doesn't even have a transmit routine. Engineers ran fault trees, blamed interference, shrugged when nothing lined up. The file closed under unresolved signal anomaly, a bureaucratic shrug that left more questions than comfort. Priya pored over the report on a night flight to Singapore, highlighter scarring every third line until a single footnote snagged her breath. Short-range electrostatic discharge within local thunderhead could mimic keyed carrier at 19 to 23 words per minute. She pictured their storm-blasted beach, the mast's copper throat pointed skyward, stray lightning jittering across the gap, nature itself sending the illusion of a human reply. The idea chilled her, then oddly warmed her. If the ocean delivered its own echo, maybe that was answer enough. Luis preferred a simpler faith. On stage at the inaugural Delgado Kapoor Marine Scholarship Banquet, wrist now a scar-stitched roadmap, he held up Maya's recovered footage, a 38-minute tape of dolphins, crab jokes, and the last sunset aboard Sea Glass. This, he told the crowd, is proof that stories outlive storms. The hall cheered, and for an instant he could almost hear Owen's quiet chuckle somewhere behind the applause. 2 years later, Sam published an indie graphic novel titled The Copper Signal. In its climax, a sea monster guides a cyclone-tossed lifer raft toward a phantom lighthouse made of lightning, then vanishes before dawn. Reviewers called it Lovecraft meets Shackleton through a 13-year-old's eyes. Sam didn't correct them, explaining that the monster was actually his uncle. Steering from beyond the breakers felt too private for print. Lena, camera finally traded for a journalism degree, produced a documentary that stitched Maya's tapes to Coast Guard flight footage and animated reconstructions of the mast raising. Festivals praised its unsolved undertone, the nagging suggestion that rescue might have hinged on coincidence, providence, or something stranger. During a Q&A in Toronto, an audience member asked whether she believed a supernatural force had saved them. Lena answered only that the spark gap had popped 3 times, and those 3 pops carried them all the way home. Anything beyond that was speculation. Mark, ever the navigator, kept plotting. Retirement idle time became a search project funded by small grants and stubbornness. He and Elena chartered sonar runs over the reef, trying to pinpoint sea glass's final resting place. They located fragments, a stainless steel galley sink, a length of mast too bent to be their antenna, but never the hull itself. In off-camera moments, Mark admitted he would rather not see the cabin where Owen's hat still lay. Better it stays an outline on sonar, he told Elena. She understood. Some doors are meant to remain thresholds, never actual rooms. 5 years on, the 6th blanket reunion drew a crowd: scholarship recipients, documentary fans, junior Coast Guard cadets who'd memorized the case. They gathered on a California bluff at dusk while a portable projector threw Lena's film onto a sailcloth screen. When the credits rolled, Priya produced a battered notebook, pages still puckered from salt, and flipped to the list no one had seen since the island. 1. Trust the sea. 2. Trust the signal. 3. Trust that someone is always listening. She added a 4th line in fresh ink. 4. If no one listens, speak louder, build the mast higher. They sealed the notebook in a weatherproof capsule and buried it beside the bluff's lone palm. GPS tagged for future wanderers. Luis tapped the soil once with his cane, ceremonial, then stepped back so Sam could press a tiny copper wire, salvaged from the island mast, into the ground like a seed. Night settled, soft and salt-sweet. Far below, waves combed the shore in endless meter, carrying and erasing footprints with impartial rhythm. Lena aimed her lens at the dark horizon, testing shutter speeds for star trails, but didn't release the button. Some moments, she decided, refused to be captured twice. Overhead, the radio tower at Point Loma rotated, its sweep tracing an invisible circle across the sky. Somewhere in that spray of electromagnetic whispers, 500 kilohertz still pulsed in ghostly dots and dashes, ignored by satellites maybe, but not entirely silent. Every now and then, an amateur operator in Queensland or a cargo radio tech off Chile reported a faint, irregular carrier. 3 short bursts repeating at odd hours. Most dismissed it as atmospheric noise. A handful saved the logs, hunting triangulations that never quite closed. To the 6 who survived, the mystery no longer demanded solution. It existed the way gravity exists, unseen, unquestioned, inexorable. A reminder that the ocean sometimes answers back in its own voice, and that rescue can arrive on footsteps no human ever meant to take. On their final night together that season, they stood shoulder to shoulder on the bluff's stone ledge. No speeches, no cameras, just wind off the Pacific humming around ears still attuned to static. When Mark finally spoke, he did so softly enough that wave noise nearly swallowed the words. Storms come fast. Sparks fade faster. Keep your gear dry. They laughed, a thin, grateful sound, and let silence close the circle. In the hush, each felt again the echo of 3 tiny pops across a spark gap on a forgotten island, and understood without needing to say it. That survival stories rarely tie themselves neat. Loose ends drift, signals wander, yet some truths remain bright as magnesium against storm clouds. They were heard, they are here, and sometimes when the sea steals a voice, it lends one back. The wind carried the unspoken line seaward, scattering it over black water that gleamed like polished copper beneath the moon.